Hello everyone, this is part 41 of What If Naruto was in Anbu at 6, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. The harrowing howl of a fell wind gripped the Akatsuki members within the chambers to their bones. The creeping grip of the cold reaching up and wrenching them from their stupors. Seeping deep into the marrow, forcing a shiver through the nerve endings that rode along their spine, crawling up the back like a swiftly crawling spider. There was silence for a moment, punctuated by the grating of the still moving chains. Then a low, which grew into a L shriek, as though the voices of damned souls had just arose from the depths of the underworld. The sound made them all pause, before it increased, clutching at their ears. Melting ice was dislodged, white chunks sliding across the wooden floor of the raised dais. It took only a moment for these men to realize where it was coming from. The statue. The ceiling statue, it was in pain. And all at once the source became all too clear in their eyes as the once reddish chakra emerged from the inanimate object's mouth, flooding across the room, searing and clothing, forcing each of them to leap away, onto the walls as the scarlet hue of hell was reinserted within the seal. It crawled up the chains, bringing the smell of molten metal and smoke into the room before they rose further and further, their paths culminating onto a single target. The S-Godime of Konoha. It burned its way through their seal like living acid, flowing and strong, entering the cage's coil system with natural violence that awoke the greatest of the Jinchuriki with a strangled gasp, consuming sweet oxygen, as he gulped it down. He was aware of the pain, currently rushing through his system, relishing it. Pain was a sensation, and sensation was the realm of the living. Conan, what is this? What the hell did you do wrong? Kisum roared at the lone female of the group, who watched the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes, abstract horror etching itself slowly onto her features as she realized that this monster had done the unthinkable. He had not only survived but beaten the extraction itself. Was he so fully fused with the Ninetales now that the link could not be severed? Naruto slumped, his breathing heavy. A sheen of sweat marred his head and face, trailing down his nose and falling towards the dais below. He blinked, lids closing over dull eyes momentarily before opening once again, heart blue shifting as he struggled to take in everything in sight. The others below him stared as the vast majority of the demons expelled chakra finished re-entering the body of their prisoner, leaving only the red haze of a mist aloft in the room. Itachi's gaze traveled to Conan as the five found their feet back on the wooden dais. What happened? He questioned, voice guarded, carefully devoid of emotion. But he could not fool her. He was worried, rattled, perhaps even fearful. He, as they all had, figured that this would be the end of it, the end of him. That this would mark the day, the Devil King of Konoha. But instead he lived, still containing his Bayu. Every second he spent alive, even as a prisoner, was another second he could escape, another second he could turn on them, K them. The same trick would not work twice, and his power had already proven great enough to defeat 4 of them. Possibly more. Conan turned from the room, with a flare of her red cloud cloak, marching down the stairs, intent upon the room containing the seal designs, to discover what had gone wrong. Everything was so precise, so meticulous, so precise and calculated. Where had they messed up? Everything had been done perfectly. Now they needed to wait, 3 days of preparation, all for nothing, wasted. Conan marched through the icy hallways of the fortress, with tangible fury beneath a cold facade. Her cloak, billowing near her ankles with her rushed pace. She clearly sought to avoid her 4 peers, not having the answers they no doubt sought for themselves. Her shoulders were tense as she walked, and she ignored the groveling subordinates and Chunin servants as they bowed hastily, making way for her passage, pressing themselves firmly against the walls as they did. She marched straight towards her quarters, never once giving a backwards glance down the hallway towards the chamber she recently vacated, opening the door and exit behind her as she entered. Her room was small, but adequate, as were everyone's. The floor, walls and ceilings were all lined with wood, though the ice around that always kept temperatures very cold here, requiring many furs to be spread throughout the floor and bedding in order for any human to not freeze to death in the middle of the night. It held a bed, a small equipment locker, a desk, and finally, on the far wall, a small, bowl-like wooden carving with seals running along the inside, all gathering at the bottom, forming a tight circle. Marching towards it, the blue-haired woman removed the ring on her index finger, the byaku, and placing the centerpiece kanji down in the center of the tiny circle at the bottom of the bowl, she soon watched the seals glow bright white. Placing her hands on the sides of the bowl, she soon felt the familiar presence of pain within her mind. Why do you seek an audience with me, Conan? You know I cannot afford distractions such as these. Came the Akatsuki leader's voice, echoing within the confines of her mind. There is a problem, she responded quickly. The ceiling, the cage of Konoha, he managed to reverse it. There was silence within her mind for several moments, and for a while she wondered if somehow these seals too had malfunctioned, or if pain had banished their connection for some reason. But soon his voice projected itself again in her thoughts, ringing with incredulity and disbelief. What? He has somehow managed to reverse it. The blue-haired Nin repeated slowly, already feeling the disbelief shifting to anger, prickling the back of her mind with its unpleasant pressure. That is not possible, he hissed, and she could almost see the purple ringed eye bearing down on her. All Jinchuriki the moment the Bayu is extracted. He could not have reversed it. Conan said nothing, merely waited for his fury to abate before she would speak again. The last thing she needed was for him to think her inept by spewing out some ignorance, of which, thanks to this matter, she had an abundance of at the moment. I shall return soon. Rest, for we will begin the extraction process immediately after I arrive. Before she could say anything more, his presence abruptly vanished, and the seals over the medium receded, vanishing back into her ring, the glow fading. She reached for the metal band again, taking it from its resting place before it donning it on her finger. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. The wind howled outside their hastily erected shelter, a hollowed-out dome of snow, ice and whatever spare materials they could each find. Temari hugged the spare heat-sink blanket closer to her, grateful for the old man's, Yoshihiro's, mind for preparation, having several sets of equipment gear in one of the few scrolls he had, enough to feed them, keep them warm and give them some adequate equipment to make this ice dome. It was a cramped little space, with a pit fire inside with a very tiny hole at the top to release the smoke. The wind barely entered the opening, but the chill still craced through their bones, sinking into the marrow. The young Suna Kanoiki shivered within the confines of her blanket, her body, unused to the cold and more used to the searing desert heat of Suna, or even the warm humidity of Konoha rather than this bone-chilling cold. The others were asleep, lids closed but be alert, waiting for any type of unnatural shift in movement outside the dome to awaken, alert and ready for a fight at a moment's notice. In deep cover missions, one did not have the luxury of a full night's rest, and so one needed to make do, with 6, 5, maybe even 3. One did not want to waste valuable recuperation time in trying to fall back asleep every time some wild animal passed over their awareness. And so the act of falling in and out of sleep was a relatively simple matter, achieved through simple acts of meditation taught when one joined the Junin ranks, where deep strike missions in enemy territory were a given. But even with her own training in this art, sleep eluded her, eyes traveling repeatedly to the young woman who lay huddled in a fetal position within the dome, instinctively trying to conserve whatever heat was in her body as she slept. After her fainting spell, several hours ago, she had awoken in screams, eyes wild and frightened like a wild, wounded animal. Hands shaking as she hyperventilated, only calming after several minutes of being held down by Yoshihiro and Kakashi. Her shaking had not ceased until they had finally touched down and began erecting this small shelter, and she had barely spoken a word before she had gone to sleep. She ignored the questions thrown her way, until all three of them had simply allowed her to keep her silence. As her eyes wandered to the sleeping woman, her mind wandered to the brother they were currently seeking out. Newly arisen questions blended with the old doubts that had lingered in her mind over everything that she had ever known, or thought to have known about the man were strengthened, and her certainties becoming less and less. She wondered who this woman was, what relationship she had with Naruto before whatever happened between them had torn them apart, and driven her to exile. Had there been a relationship at all? Did he know who she was? If he did, then he had done a most excellent job of not mentioning her. Then again, he did a tremendous job of not mentioning anything unless she pried the information away from him with considerable effort. She had heard rumors, even in Konoha, of Suna's angel. The Kunoichi that had charged, alone into enemy lines and forced Ataki Kakashi to retreat single-handedly. That had been only the beginning in a long series of raids and defenses that had escalated her fame throughout the elemental nations. Supposedly dressed in soft hues of white and blue, she stood as a beacon of light to any and all who hated Konoha's Devil King, and everything he and his militant empire stood for. How could two people born of the same bee turn out so differently from one another? What cruel fate of circumstance had done this so that she would be spared what he had to endure? Or had they both perhaps began as the same but she changed along the way? Something happened to her that did not happen to him. Or had happened to him that didn't happen to her. This was all so frustrating. Every time she seemed to have a handle on the situation involving him, and her opinion of him something else came along and threw a metal bar between the cogs of her brain to throw everything out of whack again. As if sensing the eyes drilling through the top of her head, the lids rose allowing pools of light blue to scan the torchlight whiteness before raising and finding the young Sabaku staring straight at her. Temari opened her mouth but in the end only one question came to mind. What's changed? Akina stared straight back at the Sabaku, averting her eyes only for a single moment before she responded, voice scratchy and hoarse from lack of use throughout the day. You tell me. Adjusting her position once again, Suna's angel was soon asleep, leaving Temari alone with her own thoughts until the sun peered over the horizon once again. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Above the dais he waited. Waited for them to return, or for the others to arrive. The faint mist of the Kyuubi's chakra beneath him had yet to recede. He teetered in and out of consciousness, feeling his strength and formidable power sapped away from him due to the seals. He knew that they had attempted the extraction. Though he hadn't been conscious for the procedure, his body felt wrong, out of place, as though it wasn't really his own body. It may have been the weakness of his limbs, or the constant darkness that clawed at his awareness. He wasn't used to being in such a deplorable state. He didn't know how he had survived. What had gone wrong for them, or right for him? He could theorize though of course. The safest guess so far was either human error, or lack of knowledge on their part. Their seal must have been like his own, focusing upon extracting the chakra, and holding the consciousness of the great demon, using the creature's own mind as an anchor for the rest of the chakra it held. With him however, there was no consciousness to grasp, the beast's mind was within the full of a girl, Akina. No mind, no anchor, and the chakra returned, naturally, to the location that was nearest, and most familiar to it. To him. And thus, saving his life in the process. The Yuki had flooded his system, now draining him of his energy as its side effects seemed to hit. His eyes drooped, and he attempted to summon the will to remain conscious. The longer he stayed conscious, the longer he could contemplate an escape, or at least watch these men exploit any potential weaknesses their conversations may show. But the thread of consciousness was thinning, and his feeble grasp in the plane of reality was waning. His eyes dropped with heaviness before falling closed completely and his body once again went slack, hanging limply from the chains. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. The snow battered against their bee, clinging tightly to their clothing and hair. The blankets they had used to sleep in now draped over their shoulders and be a fragile, thin veil against the biting winds. Snow had given way to thick blankets of ice and hail that clung to them like sheets of white. Kakashi led them on, his stark white hair falling into the surrounding background, almost indiscernible, only his darker clothing allowed for Yoshihiro, who took up the rear of the group, to keep sight of him. It was a slow trudging pace they kept, the winds too strong to take flight, and the ice too slippery to run on without risking injury. Kakashi followed the thin thread of red chakra that extended from Akina as if drawn to a beacon. At this point, it was their only hope, even if he wanted to turn back, knowing where was south was near impossible in this bleak gray weather, that barely allowed even him, and the Sharingan to see beyond his own hand. How could anyone live in this place? Where would they get food, water? How would Naruto himself have survived these conditions in his state? How did? Kakashi suddenly lurched forward, as if he'd stumbled out of a thick bush into an open field. His eyes darted left and right, startled and wide-eyed before swiveling around on his heel at the sound of the others, Akina, Temari and Yoshihiro, calling his name. Only to come face to face with a shifting wall of wind and ice, looming over him like a daunting obstacle. An obstacle which they just passed. He looked deep into the veil of silver gray, the silhouettes of the others soon peeking into his vision like misty ghosts. Their voices, called out to him, startled, and muffled by whatever stood between them. He reached out, wincing as his hand once again entered the biting winds and harsh cold and latched onto the first silhouette's arm. He felt it jerk and struggle, and he quickly yanked it forward, bringing Temari stumbling into his sea as the wind resistance gave way to nothing. She blinked, stupidly glancing around in confusion and bewilderment before Kakashi moved around her, reaching forward and soon pulling out Akina and Yoshihiro in a similar manner. The older Tsuchikage whipped his head over and around, confused just like all the others until his eyes found the shifting wall of ice he'd just been pulled out of. The older man took several steps back, craning his end back in order to look all the way up, in an effort to see the top of the unnatural weather. A Shuishu Tenku no Gokuen. Weather-altering seal. Kakashi stated looking back to the older male. I thought they haven't been used since the dark days before the allegiance of the first 5. They haven't, the Tsuchikage said with a shrug. Temari bobbed her head side to side with a, isn't that obvious look, when you need clients to actually make it to your village to get money, doesn't really pay to have a seal that makes it damn near impossible to reach a village. I mean without Kakashi being able to follow the chakra thing from The Suna Kanoiki paused, momentarily forgetting Akina's name before she recalled it with a brief look over her shoulder. Aki Akina. The Kanoiki yelled, whirling around with a double take, finding the young woman laying face down on the snow. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Conan. The blue-haired woman's eyes snapped open, blinking rapidly to clear the haze of sleep as she sat up from the various furs that made up her bed. Before she could even bound her legs over the side of the bedding, the door to her room was open, allowing her the sight of a wild-looking Itachi standing along the door frame. His breeds heaved his seat to and fro as he leaned along the side. We've got a problem. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. A red haze pulsed with a low, methodical thrum, a repeated vibration that shook through her sea as she opened her eyes, only to find this reddened haze obscuring her sight. Her arms shook with weakness, muscles trembling as she struggled to lift herself off the floor. Hissing and grunting, she soon fell again, scraping her chin painfully against the cold stone floor. A soft clack 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 reached her ears, bringing her eyes upwards, to find the familiar red hood and cloak behind the haze of red, a deep, ink-black background looming ominously behind him like a gaping maw. The thrumming of the mist around her increased, the vibrations growing so strong they were physically painful as they rattled her rib cage, prying a pained groan from her tea as she clutched at her sea. He came closer, stopping at the edge of the red mist, and Akina soon felt, and heard, deafeningly loud cracks ring through the air somewhere behind her. Slowly, painfully, she turned over. Now laying on her back, she looked down, finding a great, crumbling wall before her, going far to the right and left, before its edges were swallowed by the dark shadows that surrounded them. The wall cracked again, with more, heavy chunks of concrete raining down around them. From the new, tiny openings the blonde woman watched as red chakra seeped out, pulling at the red haze around her. Her vision was obscured suddenly by the red cloak. She blinked, realizing that Naruto now stood between her and the crumbling wall. Suddenly, the painful vibrations through her sea became crippling, forcing her to curl in on herself, vision becoming a blurred haze of distorted lines and colors, breaths coming in harsh, heavy pants. She noticed, vaguely, the red chakra shift and coalesce in front of Naruto, who stood between her and it. And somewhere in the back of her mind his words reached her ears. Carrying that familiar edge and guttural tone due to the mask. You seek to take advantage of the situation. Pathetic. The chakra around her sizzled and burned, stronger for a moment before his voice reached her again. You forget your place. She opened her eyes, just in time to see Naruto raise a single, gauntlet-clad hand, and felt, more than saw, the red chakra around them gather there. The pain she felt, vanishing enough to allow her to prop herself up on her elbows. She stared at his back, finding the red chakra swirling above him like a tornado, pulled into his raised palm like gravity. She sucked in a breath, opening her mouth to speak, but soon, the world faded, blinking out of existence with a bright flash. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Akina awoke with a strangled gasp, rising up from the ground as if someone had pulled on a chain along the center of her sea. Only to feel two hands press down on her shoulders, pinning her to the ground. These little episodes of yours are really getting annoying, girl, was Yoshihiro's disdainful grunt. Akina greedily gulped in air, as though starving for it, coughing as the cold wind instantly dried out her tea and mouth. What the hell is wrong with you? Yoshihiro questioned. With the cold winters of Iwa, he was partially used to such weather, and didn't realize why she'd suddenly started hacking up a lung. It was Temari, however, that practically shoved him out of the way, scooping up some of the snow and ice before cupping it into the girl's lips. Akina swallowed, melting the small bits of ice in her mouth before she did. A sound, not unlike a thunderbolt, tore through the fogged sky, and everyone's eyes immediately turned northward, where a red blotch appeared to have spread over a part of the horizon like spilled in, rumbling with vicious crackles of energy. Akina breathed, swallowing before she staggered to her feet as the glow faded. We have to move, now. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Within the chamber dozens of people ran to and fro, a frenzied panic in their eyes as they glanced upwards to the crackling red lightning bolts that escaped the chains around the Jinchuriki's body. Itachi and Konan rushed up the stairs, coming to a halt as they saw Kisame, Deodara, Zetsu and Sasori already on site, with Kisame and Sasori barking out orders to all of the floundering incompetents around them. What happened? Konan yelled at the younger Uchiha. We don't know. The chakra began acting up again, no warning. It's actually straining the limits of our absorption seals. The Uchiha answers, ducking as another red bolt of chakra sailed across the room. Konan said nothing, for she had nothing to say, and found that all she could do was turn her eyes upwards to the creatures still chained and unconscious above them. How was he doing this? Could he truly be this strong? This monstrous? Slowly, ever so slowly, she watched as those closed lids lifted, revealing, with every centimeter, that familiar red iris, bearing down on her. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX. The fear, so primeval and wild it was barely above the instinct of fight or flight, shook the blue-haired paper witch to her bones. A powerful, paralyzing emotion that spread to every fiber of her body as those dark red eyes continued to bear down on her from their place above. She closed her eyes, forcefully wrenching them away from the sight with a barely suppressed shudder, and whatever spellbound emotion of fear she had felt vanished as she lost sight of his gaze. Her gaze hardened, and her resolve solidified, bolstered as her mind moved quickly to contain the situation, to contain him before he could recover more of his former strength. Kisame, move on to section 7 of the seal, channel your chakra into it with the ram hand signal. Toby, Deodara, sectors 12 and 9, use the ox and bird seals respectively. Itachi. She turned to look over her shoulder at the raven-haired Uchiha. Trip him up. Marching over to another portion of the seal, Konan placed her hand firmly down upon the dried ink, forming a single seal with her other hand as she too began channeling chakra into the construct. Itachi's spinning Sharingan eyes trailed slowly towards the hanging figure, a twitch in his jaw being the only shift in his expression that belied his current unease. His hands rushed through a quick sequence of seals and above him, Naruto tensed in preparation, bracing his muscles for the he knew was coming. With a spark and crackling flare, lightning burned to life in the Uchiha's hand and with a grunt, he launched it upwards. Unable to brace himself, the lightning s into him with full force, a searing burning sensation spreading over his entire body. His muscles tightened and loosened spasmodically, bursts of lightning were strengthened and weakened at random intervals and locations, not allowing him to become used to the sensations. His teeth clenched so hard that he felt pain in his jaw bones, muscles tightening so much he felt they would snap or his bones would break. Heightened senses, usually a blessing in the ninja world, now proved their cursed weight. He could almost feel the calcification of his bones, the electricity racing along his veins through the iron minerals in his the spasmodic pumping of his heart as he entered the first stages of ventricular fibrillation. Abruptly the sensation was off, and Naruto was allowed a short reprieve before he heard Konan's voice reaching into his ear. Hit him again. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. The four shinobi rushed through the snow, using chakra to tightly pack the snow beneath their feet in milliseconds as their feet made contact with the shimmering white surface, allowing them an unbroken stride as if they were in Kumo's plains rather than this frozen wastelands. In the distance, about half a mile away if they had to guess, the four could begin to see the towering formation of ice, a structure that had stolen their breath when they first found its full body beyond the fog and misty ice. I did not think man could build such things, had been Yoshihiro's stunned assessment. It was tall, unbelievably so, so much so that its very tip reached above the clouds and they could not even see it. It gleamed like a spike of sapphire in the thin lights that broke through the perpetual storm. At its base, the structure jutted out with massive spikes in every direction. It was nearly as wide as Konoha itself, becoming thinner and thinner the higher it went, until finally the dozens of spikes dropped in number to just one. It seemed like a knife, seeking to reach the heavens themselves. At the juncture, where the base structure condensed itself into the tower, that was where all four of them could see the faint red glow, flickering and dimming with each passing moment. Got to move faster, the Sharingan wielder hissed before he increased his pace. As fast as they ran, as much distance as they covered, the citadel of ice only loomed over them more ominously with each step, and the red glow continued to diminish, a roaring fire being doused till it was merely a cinder. Kakashi felt a myriad of emotions flare up within him as he, more than any other except for possibly Naruto's own sister, whom had inadvertently led them here, could sense and see, physically see with his Sharingan as Naruto's strength and force was being leached from him. A hopeless fear, a blinding rage, a curdling indignation. All these welled up, and swirled in his stomach until he felt he would burst from them. It was a horrifying ordeal. Naruto was not only his commander, and leader for over a decade. He wasn't just the person that Kakashi trusted could keep this entire thing from falling apart at the seams and thus condemning the last 10 years of his life and the progress of the villages into a meaningless, senseless bee that would become nothing more than a footnote to the histories. He was also someone that he had known since the young man was born. He had been there, been one of the Anbu that had trained him while he was still just a fledgling and not the Ani of power he was now. Seen and read the health reports, the checkups, the psychological monitoring of the boy's condition. Only when he had washed his hands of the Anbu core, had he lost contact with the boy, for a mere 4 years, merely hearing of him in passing and whispered words of dread. Until that fateful day where Sandaime had drawn the boy to that false mission. In the hopes to undo what had become AK 13 years in the making. Since then he'd become involved, entangled in the fabric of his life, as they all had been. And the thought of Naruto's mere feet away while he was too slow to arrive, for various reasons, was more than he could stand. So focused was Kakashi on the fading signature, it was Yoshihiro that had to bring him to a halt with a rough grip on the back of his vest. What are you doing? The copy nin hissed at the older male who merely pointed ahead of them. We actually have a welcoming committee. He answered, gesturing ahead of them with a nod of his head. Kakashi turned his jewel-colored eyes to the gestured area, finding a crowd of, if he had to give a rough estimate, 50 or so ninja rushing towards them. If their Junin level were finished. Temari said, flaring her fan wide open. Then we'd better hope they're not Junin level. Akina stated, drawing her signature 3-pieced staff before she rushed past Kakashi and the others, charging the group head-on in a familiar display. Kakashi had been on the receiving end of once. Crazy brat. Yoshihiro grumbled before his warhammer was unleashed from a scroll before he too rushed after her, followed by Temari whom had taken to the sky on her fan. Kakashi's eyes, however, once again raised themselves towards the red glow at the base of the ice tower. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Hit him again. Itachi took a deep breath, hearing those words for what must have been the 12th time in the last 30 minutes. With every jolt of chakra-formed electricity he felt the oppressive presence of the demonic chakra diminish more and more. Several times he'd see off the flow, in fear of actually the troublesome prisoner, and for a while it seemed as though Konoha's cage would give up the fight, and he could feel Kisame, Deodara, Toby and Conan's chakra pushing his own back, suppressing it back into the seal that had come dangerously close to shattering before their arrival. Lightning leapt from his fingertips again, fangs of blue flame latching onto the blonde like a vice, sinking into his bones. He was left panting, in pain and out of breath as the attack away again before he rebolstered his hold over the escaped chakra of the Ninetails. Normally, he would have given up the first time his chakra was pushed back, knowing that as it progressed, with Itachi's interference it would become less and less likely that he would prevail. And so would be better to save his energy, since he could not be sure just how much control he would wield over the destabilized demonic chakra once he did escape this seal. But he was also aware of something they weren't. She was coming. And though he held no great faith in his younger twin's skill and power, the fact was that through her blind ignorance she wanted to save him from these individuals for some sentimental tripe or other only served to his advantage given the situation. He cared not for her motivations, only in her chance of success. And the fact remained that she held a much greater chance of success than he did at the moment. Perhaps, when they were all focusing on her, distracted by her, he could attempt his escape again. But until then he needed to do the only thing he could do from this disadvantageous position. Weaken them. With every second he resisted, that was another second they needed to expel their chakra to hold him at bay, coupled with the initial attempted sealing that had drained him of energy already. He hoped that these ninja would enter a fight with his sister, at the very least with only 3 out of 4 of the normal reserves. The fact that he could only put faith in her skill, something that had repeatedly succeeded for her only in surviving their encounters and not truly damaging him without outside influence, did not sit well with him at all. But the fact remained that she was also the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, and possibly had the best chance out of anyone, save for a small army of Anbu and some of his elite ninja, to get him out of the situation he currently found himself in. And as blue flames s into his sea once again, and spread out to his extremities the blonde cage. Heard, more than saw the ninja that rushed up behind Conan. Mar disturbance southwest, was the message his ears were able to pick up over the deafening roar of the electricity running through him. The sound of his own bee was deafening to his ears, and with only a vague cry of a startled, what, graced the shell of his consciousness before he finally sickbed to blackened abyss. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Mom, there's a disturbance in the southwestern perimeter. Conan's gaze snapped back to look over her shoulder at the messenger, prompting him to continue with the simple movement. 4 chakra signatures, Mom. We believe that it's Hatake Kakashi from Konoha. What? The blue-haired woman suddenly roared, standing and rounding fully on the man, who suddenly felt very small beneath the paper witch's fury. Ha, Hatake, the man began to stutter out the Repaian, but Conan didn't pay much attention. She had heard him very clearly. How could Kakashi be here? How could he have followed them, or gotten through the storm? Did he get a message out? What if it was not only him and 4 ninjas on their way, but half of Konoha's military bearing down on them? He could be an advanced scouting party for the main force. But Conan shook these thoughts away. Iwa, the nearest Konoha-controlled territory, was 4 days away. There was no way a message could have reached them, and their armies could have been mobilized this quickly. Still, this did not mean Kakashi's group could not double back to get reinforcements. Focusing her eyes back up on the man, see off his babbling with a sharp order. Get down to the barracks. I want every warrior we have outside and battle ready before they're even 100 yards of this structure. Tangle them up, make sure they do not manage to escape until we arrive. Yes, my lady, the man said with a quick bow before making a hasty exit. Conan felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck rise, as the air became charged with electricity once more with another burst of Itachi's lightning technique, and finally, felt the red chakra recede and weaken in its intensity. She swiveled around on her heel, looking straight up as the blonde ninja's form finally fell still, with nothing but shuddering breaths to tell them he was still alive. Looking towards the others of the room, she was soon shouting out orders to them as they too felt the chakra of the QBS away and pulled away from the seal construct. All of you go, get your gear. I want you down there and this problem dealt with, now. We can't risk these people sending a message to Konoha. I will remain here and make sure the seal has fully locked away his chakra before I join you, Itachi, find Zetsu, and find Sasori. Tell one to get down there as well, and tell the other to guard the Kazekage. The last thing we need is for Kakashi to find him and see this as a free pass at Kasuna's leader. The blue-haired woman narrowed her eyes at all of them, and though she could tell that, particularly Kisame and Deodara, were not fond of taking orders from a woman, they would follow them. Mainly because neither one wanted to face Pain's fury should they break rank with her. In a grave voice, however, that brokered no argument, she made even the aforementioned two nod quickly at her words. I want no mistakes. As they each rushed off to complete the duties, Conan marched to the center of the seal. Sitting down in a lotus position, she hastily began channeling her chakra through the complex construct. Weeding through every last plane and layer of it. She couldn't afford to mess up the containment. She couldn't afford to mess up his containment. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. The clanging of steel shrieked in their ears, metal clanging noises making the people around the battlefield cringe as though nails were being scraped across tempered glass. To their immense luck, most of their enemies, or even all, weren't even at the standard level of a high Konoha Chunin. And each had trouble adapting to the distinct styles of combat each of the four intruders came with, which ranged from the almost brutish toughness of Yoshihiro, to the swift evasiveness of Temari and her wind techniques. But their numbers were beginning to get overwhelming, and more were approaching from the ice fortress. Even fire ants could bring down lions given enough numbers. Yoshihiro swung his hammer with a battle cry, breaking ribs, legs and skulls of several individuals with ease as they got hit, tried to leap over or duck under the massive weapon he wielded. Roaring as one of the desperate kids tried to jump onto his back, struggling to put his arms around Yoshihiro's massive shoulders. With a grunt, the cage jerked one shoulder forward and the little, at least to Yoshihiro, man flipped forward, his grip slipping from the older cage's end before his back hit with a solid thud against the snow, screaming as he saw Yoshihiro's foot descend on his face before they were abruptly silenced with a crack that sank his head several inches into the surface of the snow. The cage paid the S-man at his feet no other action other than grinding the ball of his foot into the man's face, and even then, it was only because of a rather hard swing he threw out with his hammer. All around him the others were taking on more than their fair share of these grunts, firing away with ninjutsu after ninjutsu, dodging those thrown back as whatever weapons they wielded flashed with flares of sparks. Akina's weapon flashed with lightning, swift and brutal in her attacks. The Akatsuki soldiers swarmed over them, scurrying like insects as they hoped to surround them. Akina moved swiftly on her feet, dodging and weaving. Though she could easily use the Kyuubi's chakra to her advantage here, possibly destroy this entire party in little more than a few moments. But something told her not to. Half was her own logic, telling her that keeping her trump card a secret for as long as possible was the smartest move she could make. But there was something else. A dull, whispered warning gnawing on the back of her mind. The young woman threw her heavy woolen cloak onto the charging ninja, a sheet of grays and white snow that blinded her opponent as she swiveled around, a kick-ass into a ninja approaching behind her. The heavy wool blinded him, keeping him in the dark just long enough for the young woman to swivel around, spearing him in the sea with a flash of lightning from the tip of her weapon. Leaping over the falling man as he fell to his knees, Akina pushed chakra towards the very tip of her weapon, gathering the electricity in a tight ball before she flipped in midair, swinging her staff in a wide, powerful arc before she s the tip onto the icy surface, kicking up snow with the impact and subsequent shock wave. Several sparks and blinding white flashes stung her eyes as the voltage trailed over the frozen water like liquid soap over tiled floors, racing up and down the Akatsuki soldiers' damp clothing. They lost control of their muscles, twitching and screaming in agony as they writhed on the ground. As the young woman landed, she found a sudden kick was delivered to another approaching Akatsuki warrior's face to her right, startling her a bit before she registered it had been Kakashi that had delivered the blow. Paying no more attention to the copy nin, she rushed forward, a flying kick-ass into another of the Akatsuki soldier's face. Landing, she lashed out with her three-pieced staff at two others, the last of which attempted to grab the metal weapon before a bolt of lightning sent him skidding across the ice on his back. The young woman's sixth sense was the only warning she received before she ducked low, allowing another of the warriors to sail over her head, into several of his comrades. She allowed a spared glance behind her, finding she owed that to none other than Yoshihiro. Above them Temari soared with her fan, twisting and weaving between projectiles and jutsu. The Suna princess couldn't help but take a moment to appreciate the rush, the familiar feel of adrenaline, fear and sheer exhilaration she had been deprived of for the better part of the last several months. Through the worry, through the fear and anxiety was the spark of sheer enjoyment as she felt the crisp, cold northern air against her face, her hair caught in the wind and the rough grip of a weapon in her hands as she descended in a dive towards the crowd of ninja. She could see that three, more than any of the others, were the main attackers that were launching volley after volley of jutsu towards her. She banked right, a sharp turn in her dive as she avoided several small fireballs before sweeping downwards again and sharply to the left, approaching the three Nina's left side. They backed away, spreading out, away from her path, an instinctive fear they couldn't suppress at the sight of an object about to fly so close overhead. Temari adjusted her flight path, and with a chakra-enhanced push, shoved her fan straight towards one of them, while she leapt towards another one. The Akatsuki nin barely uttered a scream before the 30-pound weapon S right on top of him, burying him almost completely in the snow. Unconscious, but most likely S or S. Temari twirled through the air, drawing a kunai mid-spin before she began her descent. The Akatsuki ninja could barely adjust the aim for his jutsu before B pecked his face and C, watching, somewhat numbly as his arm began to fall away from his body, the pain, so sudden and so fast, it hadn't yet fully registered in his mind before his head was severed from his shoulders. Temari pivoted around the falling body, arm rearing back before she threw the kunai with pinpoint accuracy, towards the third aggressor. Laced with wind chakra, it C and S straight through the man's C, a clean C hole right through and L the head of a man behind him K them both. She turned, 3 chakra strings extending from her hand towards her fallen battle fan, latching onto the weapon before yanking it towards her. The Suna princess caught it with both arms, grimacing as she was reminded of just why she hated battle fans that she didn't design herself. It was heavier than hers, and the blades that made up the centerpiece were of flimsy metal that must have just barely made the C4 weapon grade. Weighty and clumsy, this was not a weapon she could appreciate. But beggars can't be choosers, she thought before turning, closing her fan as she did and smacking one of the approaching ninja, upside the head, hard. A crack vibrating through her weapon and down to her arms, sending a shudder, of something that wasn't entirely disgust, racing up her spine before she S the weapon onto the ground and lifting herself onto it in a straight handstand. Bending her arms she suddenly pushed herself into a flip, manipulating the battlefan beneath her with several more chakra strings from her fingers. The weapon twirled and opened up beneath her, the metallic blades gleaming in the bleak sunlight before she landed firmly on the interlocking blades of metal before a chakra-driven updraft rose her towards the sky, pulling him away from the various jutsu that sought to strike her, beginning the death-defying mid-air ballet all over again as more and more of the soldiers arrived, attempting to shoot her down. More and more of these grey-clad ninja arrived, swarming over and around them, and Yoshihiro could tell that they would soon be overrun. Calling out over the roar of battle cries and harried shouts of frenzied hate and pain, he addressed his 3 companions, mind returning to days of the great wars of his youth as he took the role of tactical commander. Hataki, Akina, Temari, get over here, we can't let them separate us, we have to get back to back. As the words spilled from his lips, the Tsuchikage knew that it was already too late. They circled over and around them, tripping over their own feet in their haste and inexperience, but their numbers enough to prove troublesome, isolated as they were. The only one currently free of said encirclements was the flying Suna princess above them, but even now the variety of sounds from sailing jutsu were beginning to increase. It was only a matter of time before she'd be shot down herself. Holding his hammer high over his head, an unorthodox, defensive starting stance, meant to deceive the Tsuchikage looked over each shoulder finding the same, faceless kids all dressed the same. One didn't remember faces much at his age, those that didn't reach his age. As they all encircled him, Yoshihiro wondered just how thick this ice was. Given this place's perpetual cold, he'd guess pretty deep, but he'd never heard of any ice being thicker than 20 feet below the surface. He'd only have a few sings with his hammer before these brats were on him, but with fire chakra, he'd only need 1 or 2. But still, glancing at the fortress of ice, he acknowledged that the thickness of this lake ice might be much greater than any previously recorded. So maybe 3 swings. Hopefully the shock waves of the explosions would hold these kids back, and hopefully Kakashi and this girl knew better than to loose their footing. The head of his hammer grew bright red, steam rising from it as the cold, damp air came in contact with it, the minuscule particles of moisture evaporating before they ever even touched the metal. Looking through the heat distortions in the air, the Tsuchikage growled at the assembled group of enemies. Hope you brats know how to swim. Hope my guess on this ice's thickness is decent, otherwise all I'll do is waste chakra. With a great heave, the Tsuchikage raised the massive weapon high over his head, and, realizing the elder's intent, the soldiers rushed forward, but it would be too late, far too late by the time they got to him. The beginnings of a battle cry were suddenly choked upon the lid of Yoshihiro's upper tea as a pillar of purple flames suddenly tore right past him. The ghostly fire was silent, no roar, or crackle or explosion, merely a silent rush of air, and the swiftly see-off screams of their enemies would have alerted him to its passage if he hadn't seen it to begin with. Swiveling back around to look over his shoulder, Yoshihiro was greeted by the sight of over half a dozen Suna Anbu, a platinum-haired young woman, whose arms were covered in that ghostly flame, and a wooden juggernaut materializing out of thin air. Genjutsu, the older man realized just as the Anbu rushed forward in a flurry of flashing blades and bee-wounds. Unlike the undisciplined kids around them, they released no battle cry, completely stoic in their actions as they attacked. All but one. Temari. The shout rang loud in the ears of all around them, and Yoshihiro noticed the Suna princess falter in her flight, peering down to the wooden tank beneath her. The hiss of hydraulics brought Yoshihiro's attention to the suit before the T-shaped visor broke away, releasing itself to reveal a young dark-haired man within, eyes wide in stunned disbelief as he stared up towards the soaring young woman. Raising his eyes up towards her, the Tsuchikage noticed that she was no better in her shock, mouth working wordlessly as sounds refused to escape her opening and closing lips. Several yards away, as the newly arrived Suna Anbu AB swathed through the opposing, grey-cloaked Akatsuki ninja, Akina was brought to stillness, both through the sudden lack of opponents, and the heavy presence she felt standing directly behind her, like a great weight now pressing down over her shoulders. Slowly, weapon still crackling with electrical charge in her hand, she turned, sky blue eyes finding dark violet, staring at her with various emotions lilting across her face, the least of which was shock. But the older girl stood with a guarded stance, both physically and emotionally. Recognizing that she had found her younger sister fighting alongside two of the greatest enemies and that no trust could be given freely with this revelation. What are you doing? The question, so simple yet carried with it such terrible weight and implications, the young woman of sun K hair opened and closed her lips several times, seeking an answer that refused to come to her. Finally she looked back at the purple-laced eyes and spoke. Her voice, soft yet firm, unwavering in their stance as she expressed the only truth that could give her solace here. In this place, at this stage where she found herself in. What I think is right. She felt pain blossom in her sea as Yugito reeled as though physically struck, no doubt that she too could sense the chakra fluctuations of the Kyuubi far above them just as she could. The implications of Akina's statement washing over her like a douse of cold, frigid water. She was helping him. She wanted to help him. She wasn't sure what would happen after this battle. But she knew that never again could things go back to the way they were, and Yugito felt the nostalgic desire for simpler times, when Zhuge was still sensei to them both, and only the thoughts of how they could pass his next test was their concern. How had it all come to this now, here, where they stood, possibly on opposite sides of the battle line? Where had it all gone so wrong? When had they all been swept up into this tumultuous tempest of raging fire that swept the entire world away in its fiery abyss, leaving nothing but barren wastes and ashen fields in its wake? How did it come to this? She did not know, and the answers stung the young woman's eyes with emotions. She turned away, angry at herself for her weakness, angry at Liang for his treachery, angry at Akina for her betrayal, angry at Tsunade for her despairing helplessness, angry at Yue Ying for her aloofness. Angry at everything for simply being too damn complicated. Suddenly, the Nibi container felt something vanish, a sudden emptiness fill the air before she heard Akina's strangled, choked gasp of horror. Kakashi's Sharingan eye rose heavenward, wide and disbelieving as he looked to where that chakra had been. Where it should be right now. No. The copy ninja felt spill from his lips without pause or hesitance, his body moving in wild, frenzied moves as he, literally, tore his way through the Akatsuki soldiers' lines, carving his way with kunai jutsu and sheer, desperate strength as he felt that chakra blink out of existence. The mantra repeating in his head with harried disbelief and desperate hope. No, 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 no. Akina felt as if her sea had just caved in, and her lungs, crushed as they were with the sudden weight, refused to move to her command, refused to inhale. Her B was loud in her ears, and a sudden, sharp spike of pain held her skull from temple to temple, nearly bringing her to her knees before she regained herself. Eyes, wild and in a panic, looked around, ignoring the still fighting and S-warriors, ignoring Yugito, Yoshihiro, Kakashi. Everyone, recognizing only that she needed to reach him. Reach Naruto. She needed to save him. Her eyes found Temari's slowly descending fan, and without another moment's hesitation, ran towards her. Temari. The older female was broken from whatever trance had taken her upon the sight of her younger brother, standing in this god-forsaken ice pit, and shifted towards the second Kyubi Jinchuriki, just as said young woman lunged towards her, and the Suna princess had to shift her position rather abruptly so as not to send them both falling to their painful meeting with the ice. Sputtering in ruffled anger at the abrupt and unnecessary stunt, the young woman turned to yell at the person that had been her traveling companion for the last 2 days, only for Akina to interrupt her before she even got a word in edgewise. You have to get me up there now. Temari glanced up to where she was pointing, a dawning realization settling into her mind that, where she was pointing, was the place that they were keeping Naruto, the place where he was being K. Temari looked back once, towards her brother's confused face, a pit forming at the bottom of her stomach, trepidation and fear gripping her before she pushed it down, and, in a single surge of chakra, rose into the air with another updraft. Kankuro watched her leave, wide-eyed and uncomprehending, a suspension of his motor functions as he struggled to wrap his mind around, not only his sister being alive, but helping the enemy. Only the voice of one of his Anbu commanders brought him back down to earth. The man's voice, wary and hesitating. Sir. Orders. Kankuro swallowed thickly, feeling momentarily torn between going after Temari, or his brother whom he knew was also within this fortress. He ignored the presence of Kakashi and Yoshihiro, realizing that whomever it was that had Gaara had royally pissed him off as well. Right now, they were on the same page. He'd K them after he got his brother back, and get Temari to a psych ward to help her through whatever Stockholm syndrome or sympathy of her captors be the girl was going through right now. The visor of his helmet hissed back into place as he watched the Anbu see down the last of this small, pathetic army that had come out to fight them. Mission still stands, we rescue Gaara, everything else comes second. The Anbu lieutenant nodded once and appeared as though he was about to leave towards his troop again when a shadow suddenly loomed over them both. Look out! Kankuro cried, shoving the man out of the way with a giant fist before the engines on his feet revved to life and the wheels were put in reverse, backing him away before a massive shark-like man fell over the area with a heavy sword swing. At the new intrusion, the entire group of Suna Anbu regrouped, rallying behind Kankuro, and the puppeteer made sure to register Yugito's position, as well as Kakashi's and Yoshihiro's. In a quick shunshin, another man soon appeared, this one with a spiral mask. And above them, Kankuro could now see a giant, brown bird beginning a dive. Off on the side, Kakashi narrowed both eyes on the two men. Hoshigaki Kisum. Multicolored eyes shifted slowly, vaguely looking over his shoulder from the very corner of the rim of his eye, narrowing as the crimson of the Sharingan stared back. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.